Hi, everyone. Today, what we're going to do is a review of sorts, in the sense that I'm going to, look back at the material, but look back at it in reference to your exam for this first part of the class. So, basically, to start, the exam is due the 15th by 10 p.m. And the exam is going to be covering, the two chapters that you've read, as well as all of our lectures that we've had up until this point in the class. And so the exam is worth 80 points, and I allocate the points in the exam in three different parts. Part one basically relates to the background to symbolic interactionism. It overlaps a little bit with chapter one. Part two kind of gets into chapter one, the key ideas of symbolic interactionism. And then part three, it gets into chapter two, looking at different approaches in terms of research method, theoretical pinpoints, and then also different perspectives emerging within symbolic interactionism. So that's basically an overview of what you're going to do. But let me concentrate on each part specifically. So looking at part one, basically you're matching up a social fact about an individual and then who that individual actually is. So you'll see, 5 different facts, and then you have a list of 6 different sociological social psychologists. And so one of the 6 will be left out, you won't be using for this, but the other 5, you will connect to these different facts. So for example, this person is considered to be the most famous sociological social psychologist. So who is that? Who's considered to be kind of the most famous of these individuals? And then you'll do the same thing for number 2. This person is critiqued for misinterpreting Mead's ideas. So who's the individual that sometimes people say he really didn't grasp what Mead was trying to say fully? And so you'll do the same thing for 3, 4, and 5. So some of this information can be found in the first chapter, perhaps even the second, but for the most part, you're going to find it in that background lecture that we did. When I talked about, the kind of background to sociological social psychology and the founders of the discipline. So here, go back to this PowerPoint, go back to this lecture, and you'll definitely kind of find a lot of what you need to complete part one of the exam. So when looking at part two, we'll get into, again, kind of the main ideas of the discipline. So the first question, or the first part of part two, looks at the 3 main premises related to symbolic interactionism. And I asked you to come up with an illustration, kind of an example of how that premise would look like in a real life situation. So here, focus on the first chapter of their book. You can go to the September 1st lecture. So jump down, I believe I talk about and the 3 premises here. Human beings act towards things based upon the meanings the things have for them. So what would that look like in a real life situation? How somebody's meaning for something shapes how they act towards it. And then for number 2, the meaning is derived from social interaction. So basically capturing how somebody would learn such a meaning. And then for number 3, show how this meaning could change, how it can be modified over time. And, I do this, apply, each premise to Howard Becker's Becoming a Marijuana User article. So there's where I do it. And, I talk about an example when I lived in Chicago, going through that alley as a shortcut to class, and how that meaning attached to the alley changed. So, come up with your own example of each premise to just basically illustrate what the symbolic interactionists are trying to stress, kind of within their theoretical lens. So I'm looking at number 2 in part 2. A main idea of symbolic interactionism is that meaning is fluid. Meanings can change from person to person. A meaning can change from one situation to another. And so again, we want to look at chapter 1. We want to look at this first lecture connected to our book. And here we see the slide where we talked about how, meaning is not innate, it's not static, it's subjective, and it can change from one context to another. And I kind of had this discussion in relation to the two-finger gesture, how in one context it means one thing, in another context it means something else. So, come up with your own example of that. It can be a gesture, it can be, a kind of a verbal type situation. But nevertheless, basically I'm asking you to come up with an example of how meanings do change from one situation to another. So getting into 3 and 4 in part 2, I'm looking at how meanings connect to action. So overall, we can say 3 is looking at the relationship between meaning and action on that individual level. So how a personal meaning for someone helps kind of shape how they act or how they don't act in a certain situation. And then when looking at number 4 in part 2, we're looking at how meaning connects to action on a collective level. So, basically how shared beliefs can come together to promote collective action. And, I was this morning, I was in my car listening to the radio, and this popped into my mind because they talked about how very kind of right-wing militias, very kind of conservative groups, these militia groups, kind of on the fringe of the Republican Party, kind of how they actually kind of came together with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so politically speaking, typically the Black Lives Matter movement is kind of the kind of progressive side, kind of liberal politics, where the militias are more that right-wing conservative side of politics. So you think they're kind of opposite and they would never come together for anything collectively, but actually they had shared beliefs in terms of policing. The militias, are basically, I don't want to say anti-police, but they're very suspicious of, government forms, including police officers and sheriffs. And so they actually came together with the Black Lives Matter movement to kind of help them in their kind of fight to get, better forms of policing when it comes to kind of class and race relations. So I found that kind of movement interesting in the sense that you have, politically speaking, people from way different sides of the aisle, but who actually come together for something based upon a shared belief. So that's what I'm asking you to do for number 4, just kind of come up with an example of how, beliefs, collectively speaking, can ultimately foster collective action as a whole. So now we'll move into the third part of the paper, or the third part of the exam. You're asked to basically look at the different approaches when it comes to theory and when it comes to the use of research methods, and talk about what symbolic interactionalists typically do in terms of their approach. So the first one asks you to get into research methods. So again, this ties into the second chapter, especially kind of that first part of the second chapter regarding how we broke it down in our syllabus. And this ties into the September 3rd lecture. So here we talk about kind of approaches to method, and then also approaches to theory. So this lecture, that first part of chapter 2, nicely ties into both 1 and 2 and part 3 of your exam. So the first one, in terms of method, you talk about the qualitative methods of research or the quantitative methods of research. Of those two, what is best suited for, what's more compatible with symbolic interactionism? So you pick one of those two, either quantitative or qualitative, and you explain why that is better suited for symbolic interactionism. And then basically for number two, you're going to do the same thing, but focus on theory. Looking at grounded theory approaches or more traditional theoretical approaches. Of the two, which one is a better fit, better suited for symbolic interactionism? And so when I say traditional theoretical approaches, basically when you have a theory from the beginning, from the get-go, and you use that theory to kind of interpret what's going on. And again, that grounded theory is opposite, where you kind of get into the research, you collect information without any theory, but you let kind of the ideas bubble up, come from the ground up, and then you kind of use those ideas to create your theory kind of after the fact rather than from the get-go. So of those two approaches, which one is a better fit for symbolic interactionism? So finally, the third part of part three, you're getting into emerging perspectives or different spins that you start to see in symbolic interactionism that weren't there necessarily, at the beginning of the theory, or even towards kind of how it started to grow within American sociology. So basically, if you go to the second part of chapter 2, and you go to September 8th lecture, we talk about these kind of emerging spins. And so basically, go to that chapter, go through the lecture and identify and then explain, what these perspectives are, what these spins are. So overall, as long as you've been keeping up with the readings, keeping up with the lectures, you should be in good shape for your exam. We will have, a live session before we actually, you turn this in, the due date comes. So we'll use that as an opportunity to go through any specific questions. But as always, if you have any questions about this or anything else, feel free to reach out to me, and we'll do our best to get things straightened out. So I'll leave that there for now, and I'll be in touch with you guys soon.